Hello to all of you. Just carrying on from where we got to in this discussion of diabetes. We had ended up talking about the two types of diabetes. Type 1, which has been called juvenile diabetes, is the type where there's not enough insulin in the body to let the glucose into the cells. That key isn't opening up the door because there's not enough of the key, because you have to have it for all the cells of the body. The other type of diabetes, by far more common, maybe 90% of diabetics, is type 2 diabetes. The juvenile is type 1, the adult onset is type 2, and it's in that type where you have the strange situation of having plenty of insulin, in fact more than normal, and yet the glucose can't get into the cells. So in both type 1 and type 2, you get high glucose levels, but in type 2, you've got plenty of insulin, and it's just not working. And the situation is called insulin resistance. Now, what does it matter if your blood sugar level is high? We talked about it was even difficult to discover what was an ideal level of glucose, because people get along pretty well with their blood sugar levels being up to twice normal. Once you get up to levels that are twice the normal limits, then the sugar starts spilling out into the urine, and then you have those problems that we showed at the beginning, by which old-time doctors would diagnose diabetes. You know, the polyuria, polydipsia, and polyphagia. Now, I want to mention something about the reason for that third item that the old-time doctors saw, and is definitely part of the problem. Polyphagia, eating too much. When the person already has diabetes, we're not talking about eating too much causing diabetes, which also can be true, especially eating certain kinds of foods. But now when the person is already diabetic, remember, the glucose can't get into the cells. And the sense of hunger, having an appetite, depends on the cells, certain cells in the brain, being able to detect that the sugar level is low and you need more food. But here in diabetes, those cells are not receiving the glucose, just like all the cells in the body. The glucose isn't getting into the cells. So those cells in the brain tell the brain, you need to eat more. But the person already has a high glucose level. So that's part of the problem in diabetes, is the brain is saying you need more because the glucose isn't getting into it. They eat more and the glucose level goes higher and higher. Now, I was just saying that if the only problem is this glucose level going up, then one could say, well, who cares? It's just a number, just a laboratory number. At least values that are up to twice normal. But no, it is very definitely a problem. That's what the doctors for the past 50 and more years have discovered. They've been checking people closely that have those blood sugar levels that are now seen as being too high. Values like 135 that would have been said to be okay 50 years ago. We're now going to take a look at what happens when that blood sugar level is running too high. What are the consequences of diabetes, even diabetes that is not considered very severe? Now, the blood sugar level can, when a person is rather badly diabetic, it can go up to way more than 2 times the upper limit of normal. It can go up to 3, 4, even sometimes 5 times normal, and then they're in serious trouble. But having it just in a range maybe half more than normal is also a problem. We're going to deal with that right now. When the person is running blood sugar levels that are moderately high, one of the areas that gets affected is the eyes. And we're going to put that here. We have a retinopathy, a diabetic retinopathy that occurs. That's a somewhat long word, and we just have to explain the parts, and then it's very obvious. You recognize the word retina, the retina of the eyes, the part of it that is the film in the camera, the part that is sensitive to light and gives us the picture of what we see. Path in medicine is about damage, degeneration, damage, injury. Pathology is the study of disease. Path. So retinopathy is damaged retinas. This is diabetic retinopathy, and it's one of the most common causes of blindness. Damage number 1. Number 2. Polyneuropathy. And if you think a bit about it, you'll be able to recognize what this is. Poly means a whole lot or many. Neural, it's not too hard to recognize the root of nerve there, neuro. Path is damage. So we're talking about problems, damage occurring to the nerves in the body. It will affect all the nerves in the body, but where it shows up the first is in the longest nerves. Now, nerves are very special cells. The nerves are, let's just draw it here. The nerves have a sort of a central body and a lot of hair-like extensions that come from it, and then a wire that goes off from that body. And the essential feature of a nerve is that this body will fire. These little extensions are giving it messages as to whether it needs to fire or not. These are called dendrites. Then, if it fires, it carries the impulse, the message, the electrical signal goes down the nerve at a set speed. It's around 100 and some miles an hour. And the length of this nerve, even though it's microscopic, even here in the body, you can't see it with your naked eye, the length of the nerve is not microscopic at all. It can be a meter or more long, because all the nerves in your feet that give you sensation on your feet, the nerve body is way up here in the spine. So, it goes all the way from the spine down to the toes, so you've got quite a long length. And what I was saying was that the longest nerves in the body are the ones that are going to show the problem of the polyneuropathy first. So the first place that a diabetic person begins to recognize a problem, like numbness, that he can't feel as well in the feet, that is where it occurs in the feet. As it gets worse, and not only the toes get numb, but the whole foot, and starts going up the legs a bit, then it will start to involve nerves in the hands, because that one is fairly long too. And as time goes on, there can be involvement of even fairly short nerves. Polyneuropathy. Well, these are not very nice. It's not nice to go blind. It's not nice to have numbness in your feet. In fact, it becomes a little bit dangerous because the person could have gotten an infection in the feet, could actually have even broken bones, and he doesn't even feel pain. So this is a serious enough problem, but neither of these two is going to kill the person. But the next one is a life and death issue, and that is arteriosclerosis. Now, arteriosclerosis is a term that many people know about. It's hardening of the arteries. It's the plugging up of arteries with substances like cholesterol. And many of you will know that a person can have arteriosclerosis and not have diabetes. That is true. But the two things, arteriosclerosis and diabetes, actually overlap quite a bit. A person that has diabetes is under greatly increased risk of having arteriosclerosis and of having heart attacks. So we're putting that down as our consequence here, and by this one we're talking about life and death issues. The fourth one also is life and death, and that is renal disease, kidney disease. If the kidneys give out, unless you get some way of purifying the blood, like dialysis, then you're going to die. Now, when I learned about these things in medical school, they didn't talk, at least I didn't remember it, any discussion of something that I'm going to call another consequence of diabetes. It becomes very clear once you start working with patients in the hospital or in an office. Diabetic patients have a very serious trouble with handling any infections. They don't get over infections. Their immune system is not working well. So I'm going to call that immune impairment. So we're talking about very serious problems. That means a diabetic who gets a throat infection, a sore throat, it'll have more of a tendency to stay there. He won't get rid of it quickly. It could go on and involve his lungs. He's got a pneumonia. He won't get over the pneumonia easy. So diabetes does kill people. This involves life and death. These three things that we put at the end of this list of consequences of diabetes are life and death issues. So it makes a big difference if you can treat, or better yet, prevent diabetes. And that's what we want to get into now. What should we do to get that blood sugar into normal, down to normal range? A very important issue in eating is that what has been eaten, which is going to have glucose in it. In fact, the digestion process is breaking down starches into glucose. There's going to be lots of glucose in addition to the sweetness that we eat directly. And that glucose, if it's all alone in the substance, in the contents of the stomach, it will rush into the bloodstream and cause a high glucose level. We need something to buffer, to hold back that glucose so it doesn't rush into the bloodstream. Now, if a person has a blood sugar level that's too low, and that does happen sometimes, especially in diabetics, if they take a dose of insulin that's too high, then what do? Well, you give them a sweet juice, and it'll push that blood sugar level right back up. So we want to do what it takes to keep sweet juices and actually all food and drink from rushing into the bloodstream when we're fighting against this problem of the blood sugar going too high. A big factor that helps in that, in fact, the most important factor, is the fiber in food. Fiber that works so importantly in our digestive system to protect our colon from disease is also important in fighting against diabetes. Where is the fiber? What foods have fiber? Well, we just mentioned one issue. When you make a juice, like you would get from a fruit, basically you've taken out the fiber, a lot of it. Now, I know that orange juice does sometimes have a little bit of fiber, but it certainly doesn't have as much fiber as the orange does. So, fiber in foods is in all plant foods. And if you look at the animal foods, none of them, whether meat of any type, including fish, none of the dairy products, and no eggs have fiber in this sense. We're using it in the nutritional sense. So if you need fiber in your foods, you've got to shift over to a plant-based diet, but it's got to be a plant-based diet that includes whole plants. A person can eat a plant-based diet that is very unwholesome with very little fiber in it. Eating what they call a continental breakfast, a donut. How many donuts are whole wheat? They aren't. They're generally as white as flour can be, with plenty of sugar, a coffee, and maybe some other pastry. And soda pop, soda drinks are generally vegan, but they're very unwholesome. There's no fiber in them. So when we say a vegan diet, a plant-based diet, we mean the plants largely as they are given to us, as the Creator made them as plant food. You can process them some. We take the wheat and grind it. But don't be going and isolating a lot of things from those plant foods. Then you're often losing the fiber. So the first rule here that we want to put is, for a diabetic, the diet needs to be plant-based. To the extent that you go away from a plant-based diet, a vegan diet, you are losing the advantage that plants have of giving you that fiber and putting a brake on glucose entering the bloodstream. So a vegan diet. Now, in that vegan diet, we better put in a couple of other points, and these would apply in general. So if someone doesn't want to make the whole ideal step of becoming vegan, they should pay attention to the 2 points that we're going to make right now. And the first one is obvious. Don't eat a pile of sweet food. Even if it's whole food, for someone that's badly diabetic, they're going to have trouble with bananas and mangoes. They're a bit too sweet. If you're careful and you've treated the diabetes for a while, you might introduce some of that. But at first, you better go easy, and better yet, not use that sweet food. A real no-no is what we already mentioned, sweet juices. They just go so quickly into the bloodstream, that sugar, that you're going to wreck the management of diabetes. So, avoid significant amounts of sweet foods, and especially sweet drinks. Let's put that, especially juices, sweet drinks of any type, sweet juices. I suppose that would mean that tomato juice is an exception, but even grapefruit juice has some sweetness in it, and certainly orange juice, any grape juice, you're just going to make that blood sugar go way up. Now the second thing, and this is not really known so well by diabetics, maybe not even by all doctors, but it's very clear, the ones that that work with diabetics realize this is a very important thing about what makes the person insulin resistant. You remember we talked about insulin resistance means that the insulin will not open up the door for the glucose to go into the cells. And the main culprit in doing that is not the sweet, it's the fat in food. So we need to avoid major amounts of fat, and by fat we include oil. So this is not just animal foods that are fatty, although they're ones that you really should watch out for, but you should go easy on plant foods that are fatty, because fat oils tend to make the insulin not work well. Two major points then on the kind of diet. The ideal one is vegan, but you need to watch these other points even if it's a vegan diet. So we're talking about what goes into the body, what's going to make your fuel level. That's what the glucose is. It's your fuel. Your body needs it. If your fuel level, if your glucose level goes too low, that's bad. But in diabetes, our problem is that it's going too high, but that's the fuel coming in. What about burning up the fuel? How do we burn up the fuel? Exercise. Now, here is an interesting thing about exercise and the blood sugar level. Many people know, and I've proved it, I have trouble to keep my blood sugar level where it should be. And I've found that walking is just ideal. So let's put here exercise. Now, since I was interested in experimenting about this on myself, I thought I would try more intense exercise. I'd try running, and I did it. I checked my blood sugar before, maybe it was a little bit high. I would run a mile or more, and then check it right after. And I found that my blood sugar level was actually a little higher than it had been at the beginning. When I walked, if my blood sugar level was high to begin with, after half an hour of good walking, always the blood sugar level would go down. And sometimes it would be dramatic, how quickly it would go down, and by plenty. But running did not work the same way. And the reasoning for why this happens is interesting. When you do very intense exercise, when it's really demanding on you, then what happens, the body treats it as though it's an emergency. The little glands that produce adrenaline for emergencies, the adrenal glands, they put out the adrenaline, which makes you able to do more than you would normally do, even if you're exercising. That adrenaline affects the liver where the glucose is stored, and it mobilizes, it frees the glucose out of the liver where it's stored and puts it into the bloodstream. And if enough of that happens, your blood sugar level goes up, even though you're burning up the sugar with your intense exercise. Now, if you carried on long enough, and certainly after you've rested for a while, the total amount of sugar in your body will be less. But as a way to immediately take care of the rise in sugar level, running is not the best way. Walking is. And you could say that should be applied to other things, like if you're swimming, make it relaxed swimming to get the blood sugar level down. If you're going to do very intense swimming, doing laps at the best speed that you can, you're going to have that effect that you have for running. Now, I'm not here condemning all running or intense exercise. What I'm saying is that for the glucose effect, if you want to see the effect, its immediate effect, then make the exercise moderate. Not too mild, when we say walking, we're not talking about just sauntering very slowly. We're talking about walking decently. So let's put that in here. Exercise is moderate. And I don't know of anything better than walking, so I'm going to put specifically walking. Now, let's say that we know that someone is severely diabetic and they're already on medicines for diabetes. That would be a good time, if you're really interested in getting ideal management, to send that person to a center where we work on things like that. Send them here to the ELIC Lifestyle Center. Or another center. There are several in the United States, elsewhere in Europe. What we do is, if they're willing, the fastest, excellent results can happen if they're willing to go on a fast, eating nothing, no intake of any calorie foods. And we will maintain that for not just one day, but as long as it takes to get that blood sugar level down to the normal range, at least to 5.5 in the European units, or 100 or less in the North American units. But with doing a fast, it's extremely important. I want to emphasize this for any of you that are listening. If you wanted to try it at home, and I'm hesitating to say to try it at home, if you do a fast, you must stop the diabetic medicines. You could have bad consequences when you fast and you're taking the diabetic medicines. So we do that, though. Here we follow the blood sugar carefully as the person fasts. They're now off their diabetic medicines, and the blood sugar will come down, and it comes down not completely smoothly. Every day that you fast, it'll slowly come down in that day, but the next morning, without having eaten anything, it'll jump up a bit. Doctors call that the dawn phenomenon. It's because of hormones, just like we said about adrenaline, having an action, having an effect on the liver to put out more glucose to give the body fuel for the day to work. So if a fast occurs, you don't get upset because the blood sugar is a little bit higher in the morning than it was the night before. But you keep on fasting till it comes down, until the day that you can fast, and the next morning, even with that little rise, it's still at the desired level. There's lots more that one could say about diabetes, and especially about diabetes type 1, the things that can be done. But detailed questions may need some help from physicians. But what we've said here, the vegan diet, the guidelines here about exercise, can be applied very well at home, and I encourage all of you to do that. If you can get out of that blood sugar problem, you're really doing a great favor for yourself and others. I want to mention as a last point here that when they check people that have no diagnosis of diabetes, this has been done. They've gone out and checked people in the early morning before they've taken any nutrition, any calories in. Like we said, a fasting blood sugar must be like that. And we've talked to you earlier about how that ideal fasting blood sugar is 5.0 or less on the European scale, 90 or less on the North American scale. Ideally, the blood sugar should be there first thing in the morning. When they check people that are walking on the streets with no diagnosis of diabetes, apparently perfectly healthy, what percentage of people do you find that have their blood sugar outside, that means over that range that's ideal. Well, it's not 10%. It's way over half. It's about 70% of the public in the United States, and I'll bet it's similar here in Europe, that have their blood sugar in the morning, their fasting blood sugar, outside the ideal range. So we're talking about a problem that is all over the place, and I would call it the major public health problem when you just think of the heart attacks that result from that. Remember, arteriosclerosis is one of the big things that happen. So for yourselves and for others that you talk to, keep these principles in mind. I wish you all good health.